Good morning. So we will be doing lecture 6 today, and that is part 2 of the nervous system, dealing with the anatomy of the brain and the spinal cord and their organization. I'll not be turning on my camera today because my internet is a little bit unstable. So hopefully by turning off the camera, I will use less bandwidth. So let's get started with the study guide. First question. What are the 3 layers of the meninges from deepest to most superficial? Give a brief description for each. Okay, so the meninges is actually 3 layers. The singular word for meninge is meninx, and the deepest layer is the layer that is going to be in direct contact with the brain. That is the pia mater. So pia mater, M-A-T-E-R. Okay, so if I have to give a brief description, the pia mater is going to be very thin. Very thin. Very thin layer that actually is stuck to the central nervous system. Okay, so that adheres to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. The pia mater, it's kind of like a shrink wrap that goes on top of like a nicely wrapped piece of meat or something, right? It's like vacuum sealed onto it, and it will follow. Okay, the pia mater follows the contour. Right, so contour means all the curvature, all the grooves, and all the bumps. Right, the gyrus and the sulcus follows the contours of the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so that is the pia mater. Now, outside of the pia mater, you're going to get the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid mater. So arachnoid means spider, spider-like, right? So these are spider web structure. Spider web-like structure. Okay. And because it's the spider web-like structure, it's going to have a lot of space in this layer. So that space is going to be called the subarachnoid space. Okay, so the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. And the outermost layer is going to be the dura mater. Dura mater. So this is the layer that is going to be touching the inside of your cranium, your skull, as well as your backbone. Okay, it is a tough layer, tough, white, fibrous. Okay, fibrous means it's like very tough, basically. It's made up of fibrous connective tissue, right? So connective tissue that is directly touching, directly in contact with the inside of the cranium. Okay, cranium is just like a fancy word for skull, right? skull. Okay. And the backbone. So fancy word for backbone is vertebra. Okay, backbone. So if you open up the skull, you will see the dura mater immediately. Okay, so those are the 3 layers of the meninges. Okay, so just to show you on this diagram, I did this in the recording already, but just to refresh your memory, right? So this is like frontal slice of the head, right? So you will see the skin of your skull, right? This is your actual cranium, okay? And then you can see the dura mater actually is 2 layers, okay? And it separates into a cavity here in the medial side of your brain to form the durovenous sinus. That's for draining your CSF, okay? So let me just highlight this for you. There is going to be a pia mater here going around the brain, okay, going into all the grooves, covering like that. So that's a pia mater. And then here is one of the 2 layers of the dura mater. And the arachnoid layer is all these white spooks, right, in between. So you can see there is still a lot of space in the spooks. So that's going to be flooded with CSF like this. Okay, so that's a quick refresher for you regarding the relationship of the different meninges. Okay, now I should probably put an extra point here for the dura mater. Right, it's actually 2 separate layers that are fused together. Okay. The layers separates at some location to form the durovenous sinus. Okay, that's its place for draining CSF. Okay, so like if this is the brain. Okay, like let me try that again. Okay, so if you like this is the head, right? Okay, so if you see open like see through the head, then you will see your brain here. This is your brain. Okay, so the durovenous sinus is located like at this location, okay, kind of like that on the middle of the head, right? And that's where you will drain the excess CSF. Okay. Any question about the meninges? Okay, I see more people coming in now. Next, we have describe how each of the following protects the CNS. First one starts with the skull and the vertebral column. So these are like bony structures, right? So obviously they offer a lot of protections. Okay, so these are bony structures that offer physical protection against direct hit, like you hit your head against the wall or something, and blunt force. Okay, so something hits you in the head, maybe something fall off the shelf and hits you in the head. That's a blunt force, and thank goodness for the skull to protect our brain from getting injured from it. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. The meninges that we just talked about. What does the meninges do? The meninges, basically it anchors the CNS in place. Okay, so they're not like, bouncing around in your head. Your spinal cord is going to stay put inside your backbone. Right? More importantly, the meninges actually works with this CSF as well, right? So as you know, as I mentioned earlier, the middle layer of the meninges, the arachnoid layer in the subarachnoid space, it's going to contains CSF, okay, which provides buoyancy, right? Which means it allows the brain to be floating, okay? And something like this is good for prevents concussion. Okay, so like, this is your skull, for example, your skull, okay, skull, and then that's terrible drawing. This is the skull, and then let's say this is the brain on the inside, okay, and then all the CSF makes sure that the brain is floating in your head. Okay? So if your head goes forward, which way does the brain go? Can anybody tell me? If the head goes forward, which way does your brain go? Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. The brain actually goes backwards. Okay, so by having this layer of CSF there, it prevents the brain from hitting the back of the inside of the skull, right? Okay, unless this force is really, really hard, right? Like in football or something, right? They ram into each other's head, then the fluid might not be able to stop the brain from hitting the inside of the skull. Then the person is going to get a concussion. Concussion is basically when the brain does hit something inside your skull, and that could create a little bit of trauma. Okay, next one is the BBB. BBB is the blood-brain barrier. Okay, it is formed by astrocytes. Okay, formed by astrocytes, and the function is it creates a barrier to prevent toxins from entering the CNS. Okay, it is not a perfect barrier. It is not a perfect barrier because some substance will be able to cross. So lipid soluble, especially lipid soluble, things that could dissolve in lipid soluble substances can still cross. Okay, so some drugs, if they are lipid soluble, they could still cross the BBB and it will affect your neurological function. Okay, next one is the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so this is approximately 600 to 700 milliliters per day. It is formed by another type of glial cells. Okay, so astrocyte forms the BBB. What about CSF? What cells are responsible for producing CSF? Anybody remember? It's okay. So that is formed by ependymal cells. Ependymal cells in the choroid plexus. Okay. If you have no idea what that means, please watch the recordings. I know you guys have like a chemistry test today or something, right? So maybe you didn't have time to go through this stuff yet, but please do so afterwards. What does the CSF do? Well, CSF creates buoyancy, as we mentioned earlier. It distributes distribute nutrients, and remove metabolic waste. Okay. It also helps distribute neurotransmitters. So we talked about neurotransmitter last time, right? They are key for communication, right? Not only do they distribute it, they can also help remove excess neurotransmitter as well. Okay, so very important. Now, we have a problem if we cannot drain the CSF. Okay, I'll go through the whole flow of CSF with you in a bit, but if we cannot drain the CSF, then we got a problem, okay? Because it's going to build up a lot of pressure in the head. And here it's a CT scan that shows a transverse view of the brain. So can someone tell me what are these things? Like this location here, this big like empty space. What is that? Can someone tell me? What am I pointing at? Which part of the brain am I pointing at? Any suggestions? Okay. Those are the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle. Okay, lateral ventricles, two of the largest ventricles in the brain. In the lateral ventricles, that's where CSF is going to be produced, right, from the choroid plexus. And if you don't drain them, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of pressure pushing on these parts of the brain. Okay, and this condition is called hydrocephalus. Okay, caused by obstruction of CSF flow. Okay, so these are actually enlarged. Lateral ventricles is not supposed to be this big, but because of all the pressure that's pressing on the side of the lateral ventricles, it becomes so big. So these neurons around the lateral ventricles might be damaged, and depending which part is damaged, you're going to have different symptoms. Okay, so this is hydrocephalus. So to fix that, you will have to drain the excess fluid by creating what's called like a shunt. A shunt is like detour for the fluid to be drained. Either it's drained into a pouch outside the body or it drains into your abdominal cavity. Okay, using a flow chart, show the flow of CSF. Okay, show the flow of CSF. So just a quick poll. How many of you have watched the the recordings before you come to class today? Like if I say the cerebral aqueduct, do you guys know what I'm referring to? So if you have watched the recording, can you please choose A? If you haven't, please choose B. Okay. I think some of you are not even here right now because there's no response. But looks like only one of you have watched it. Okay, it's a really heavy lecture. I cannot possibly go through everything in this 3 hours. But I'll try to fill in the gaps a little bit. Okay, so here is a brain. Okay, this is the front. this is the back. You can always tell which part is the front, which one is the back by looking for this big spongy thing. Okay, this big spongy thing is called the cerebellum, and it's always going to be at the back of the brain. Okay, so this is a mid-sagittal view, and I want you to know that there are holes in the brain. Okay, so let me pull up the PowerPoint here to quickly show you where the ventricles are. Give me a second. Sure. One second, guys. Okay, got it. Share screen one. Okay, so you see here, this is a brain that's see-through, so you can see the inside. So in your brain, you have 4 ventricles, just like a heart, right? The heart has like 4 ventricles, well, has like 4 chambers, right? In the brains, we call all these chambers like ventricles. So if you look at it from the side, the lateral ventricle looks like a C-shape, kind of like a C-shaped structure. Okay, but if you look at it from the front, it looks more like a horn, right? Okay, so inside these ventricles, okay, so we have the lateral ventricle within each of the hemisphere of the brain. Inside these lateral ventricles, you're gonna have like a spongy structure. Okay, so the spongy structure is what we call the choroid plexus. Okay, in the choroid plexus, you are going to have these special cells called the ependymal cells. Ependymal cells that makes CSF. Okay, as we discussed earlier, it makes CSF. So when the choroid plexus here, when it makes the CSF is going to fill up the lateral ventricles, right? It's going to fill it up like that. Okay. And then what's going to happen is they will go through a tiny opening, right, called the interventricular foramen, which allows the fluid to drain into the 3rd ventricle. Okay, here's the 3rd ventricle. After you fill up the 3rd ventricle, it's going to go through a narrow duct called the cerebral aqueduct, and then it's going to fill up the 4th ventricle, and then it's going to go down a tiny canal called the central canal. Okay, so your spinal cord is very long, right? We talked about the last time, go from like the base of your brain all the way to your lower back, right? So this is your spinal cord, and in the middle of the spinal cord, there's going to be a tiny channel. Okay, that's where the CSF is going to go all the way down. Right, so that's basically where the ventricles are and how they're connected. Okay, so connecting the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle is the interventricular foramen. A foramen is a hole in the body. Okay, it's like FO and then ramen. Okay, foramen. It's a hole that's connecting the ventricles in this case, connecting the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle. Connecting the 3rd to the 4th is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so that's where it is. Now here is another view, right? You cut this is the actual brain, you cut it open. You can see there is part of the lateral ventricle, right? You can't really see the foramen. It's a tiny hole. Once you cut it open, it's hard to, see precisely where the hole was, but it's going to be around this area. It goes into the 3rd, right? Goes down the cerebral aqueduct. You can see it's very narrow. And then this is the 4th ventricle. Okay, the 4th ventricle is between the cerebellum, the spongy thing that we talked about earlier to help you orient the brain. And then there is something else called the pons. Okay, pons. So 4th ventricle is between the cerebellum and the pons. Okay. Now that we are kind of hopefully oriented with the brain, some of the parts anyways, but like I said, I know I'm a broken record, but you really got to watch the recordings to get the gist of where things are. Okay, so let's just try to draw out the flow. Okay, and I would even suggest after you watch the recording, you come back and watch this tutorial again, so it will make much more sense afterwards. Okay, so this is the blood. Okay, we actually will be filtering the blood at the choroid plexus. Does everybody understand where the choroid plexus is? Right, it's on the walls of the ventricles, right? So in the walls of the lateral ventricles, you're gonna have this sponge thing that is stuck to it. Okay, that's the choroid plexus. You're gonna have these on the third ventricle. You're gonna have these in the fourth ventricle as well. Okay, so like back to this picture here, right? You can see there's the lateral ventricle, and then you have this, spongy thing. Okay, that's the choroid plexus. This is the fourth ventricle. That's the choroid plexus. So you would have a choroid plexus that is in the wall of the ventricles of each of the ventricles. Okay, and their job is to produce CSF. Okay, so the blood is gonna be filtered at the choroid plexus, and I'm just gonna put a star here to remind you. The choroid plexus contains ependymal cells for making cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so the CSF is going to be produced by the choroid plexus at the lateral ventricle, third ventricle, as well as fourth ventricle. Okay, so we're gonna have some make in the lateral ventricles. How many lateral ventricles do we have? Just checking.
2.
2 is correct. Thank you. 2 lateral ventricles. Okay, so times 2. And then when the lateral ventricle is filled up, it's going to go into the third ventricle. Third ventricle. Now, the third ventricle also has its own choroid plexus. So it will be producing its own CSF as well. Okay, so it produces its own, but it will also be receiving it from the lateral ventricles. Connecting the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle is going to be the hole, right? Okay, a hole, an opening in the body. We call it a foramen. Foramen. Okay, and this foramen connects the ventricles. So we call it the interventricular foramen. If you block this hole for whatever reason, okay, like maybe there's a tumor growing that's obstructing the interventricular foramen, then the CSF in the lateral ventricle will build up and build up and build up. And that's one way to get what condition? What did I say like 5 minutes ago? What condition are we going to get if you block the flow of CSF? That's right. If you're thinking about hydrocephalus, that is the correct answer. Okay. So from the third ventricle, where are we going to go? From the third ventricle, we're going to go down to the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle. And connecting the third and the fourth is the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, it's a weird name, but it goes there. And then from there, it is going to go down that tiny canal in the middle of the spinal cord called the central canal. Okay. And then the central canal will take the fluid all the way to the bottom of the spinal cord where it will exit, and then it will come back up to surround the entire spinal cord. Okay, so from the fourth ventricle, it's go down the central canal, and then it's gonna go all the way down to the bottom, and then it will surround the spinal cord. Okay. Similarly, some of this will go to the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space. Right, the one we talked about earlier, around the brain. So the whole brain is going to be bathing in it, right? Now I'm missing an arrow here. Choroid plexus will also be found in the fourth ventricle, so it's also going to be producing its own. Okay, So afterwards, all these CSF will come back to drain at the dural venous sinus. Okay, remember the dura mater that we talked about earlier? It's actually two separate layers, and the two layers will open up at certain parts to form the dural venous sinus for you to drain the CSF. So all those CSF will go back into the blood, and then it just kind of repeats itself. Okay, so here is another view of the situation. Right, so we have the brain here. Right, we got the spinal cord coming down. Remember, the spinal cord becomes like horse ponytail like at the bottom. Right, so I can't really draw it too nicely, but these are the lateral ventricle, the third, and then the fourth, right? So just take a look here. Lateral goes into the third, third goes into the fourth, and then it will travel down the central canal. Keep watching. Once it gets to the bottom, it will exit, come out here, and then it will go back up, right? In the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord, right? Okay, and then some of it from the fourth will also come out, and it will surround the entire brain. So this way, your entire CNS, brain and spinal cord, will be surrounded completely by the cerebrospinal fluid, right? So it will be floating at all times. And finally, it will drain up here back to the blood through the dural venous sinus. Okay, so for a nicer picture, again, the one that I showed you earlier, this is the dural venous sinus, right? At the top of your head, right? Dural venous sinus. So all the excess CSF is going to go in there, and then it will be returned to the blood. Any questions before we keep going on this thing? Okay. Number 5, list 5 types of glial cells and briefly state their functions. So glial cells, in case you forgot, we learned that last class, actually, glial cells are supporting cells. Supporting cells of the nervous system. Okay, so far in the course, we've learned like 4 types, I think. So there is the Schwann cells. Schwann cells. Okay. Schwann cells is important because they form myelin, the stuff that speed up signal conduction, signal transmission. They form myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And then the next one is the oligodendrocytes. Okay. They also form myelin, but this time in the CNS. Okay, central nervous system. Another one is the astrocytes. Astrocytes, they form the blood-brain barrier, which filters out stuff from the blood, such that not everything is going to go into the brain. Okay, there are some toxins that some metabolic waste that might be toxic to the brain. We want to screen them out. And we have ependymal cells. Ependymal cells. We mentioned these a couple times already. They are found in the choroid plexus, which are stuck to the wall of the ventricles. And the job of the ependymal cells is that they will form cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So those are the key glial cells. Okay. Other functions of glial cells that you should probably be aware of is that they could help reabsorb neurotransmitters. There's no one specific type of glial cells that does that. Like many of them is able to do it, so I'm not going to list it out. But they're able to do that. They can reabsorb neurotransmitters when you are finished with transmitting the signal. They are also there to protect the neurons, right? Guide their growth, reinforce synapse. All these things are functions of glial cells. Questions before we move on? Okay, let's do some polls, see if you were paying attention. Go ahead. I'm not getting much hit here with the polls. Are people around, or are you guys not seeing the poll? Okay, well, thank you for the 5 people who have answered. Let's share the results. The durovenous sinus is where you will drain the CSF, and it is formed between 2 layers of the dura mater. Okay, the answer is B. Okay. Next one should be straightforward if you have been listening. Please try the next one. Okay. The correct answer is the ependymal cells, right? Okay, we just put that in the chart. Okay, let's go back to this. Next question. List examples of white matter and gray matter. Right. So you probably have heard of white matter and gray matter before, but let's quickly refresh your memory. White matter, basically, they are white because it contains myelinated axons. Okay, so again, the myelin, it's the waxy substances on top of the axon that speed up signal transmission. It's created by either Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes, depending on where you are in the nervous system. And it's a whitish, grayish, waxy substance. Okay, so that makes up the white matter of the CNS. And the gray matter is pretty much consists of cell bodies, okay, as in like the neuron cell body, unmyelinated axons. Not all axons are myelinated, especially if they're really short. You don't need myelination, as well as glial cells. Glial cells. So in the brain, we should write this down. For the brain, generally speaking, it is going to be gray matter on the outside, and white matter on the inside. Okay, there are exceptions, but that's generally the organization. For the spinal cord, it is the other way around. you have white matter on the outside, and then you have gray matter on the inside. Okay. So white matter. What are some examples of white matter? Well, the biggest bundle of white matter in the brain is the corpus callosum. Okay, corpus callosum. For those of you who don't know what the corpus callosum is, if you look at a mid-sagittal view of a brain, if you cut the brain right down the middle, you will always see this structure. Okay, this thing is always on top of the lateral ventricle. That is the corpus callosum. Okay, if you look at the PowerPoint here, right, you see the corpus callosum here again in this picture. Okay, let's go find another one. We have another corpus callosum. Right here, this is a frontal view. Right? You can see this is the corpus callosum. Okay, connecting one side of the brain to the other side. Okay, so we actually spread out a little bit like this. Okay, and it allows the two halves of the brain to talk to each other. Okay, let me see if I have more picture of the corpus callosum to show you. Right here, that's another picture. Right, oops, sorry. Corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. Okay, so it's white matter. Okay. What's this big, huge gap here? Someone tell me what this big gap is under the corpus callosum. Just try. Not quite the durovenous sinus. The durovenous sinus would be like somewhere up here, okay? Up here. Okay, this big gap. Anybody else want to try? Okay, that is the lateral ventricle. Okay, see corpus callosum underneath. There are two lateral ventricles there. Okay, so let me just go back here, right? Corpus callosum, lateral ventricle. Okay, just one more. There will be diagrams on the test, so you guys have to know what you're looking at, okay? So again, right here. What is that? Corpus callosum. And underneath, lateral ventricle. Okay. Why are we talking about this? Well, the corpus callosum is a white matter. Okay, so generally speaking, white matter is for signal transmission. Okay, so the corpus callosum. Other examples of white matter, we have the ascending and descending tracts in spinal cord. All right. Gray matter. Okay, so there's the thalamus. There is the cerebral cortex. And also the inside of the spinal cord, right, which forms like a butterfly shape. So the butterfly in spinal cord. Okay. And also there is the reticular formation. Again, I cannot possibly go into detail of what each of these are within the time frame of the tutorial, okay? So you have to watch the recordings and look at your PowerPoint slides afterwards to relearn some of these things, okay? And then you come back to this tutorial recording and then you will understand why I fill it in the way they are filled in. Okay. Okay. Now this is an important diagram that shows the organization of the spinal cord. I already did this in the recordings, but maybe I'll just quickly do a simple version of it here to so that you're not like super lost about what I'm talking about. So this is a slice of spinal cord, and you see there's the butterfly here, right? Like in the middle, right? The butterfly shape, right? That is in the middle right here. So that is the gray matter. Okay, that is the gray matter. Okay, and the gray matter is on the inside of the spinal cord, but the white matter is going to be on the outside. Okay. In the middle of the slice of spinal cord, there is going to be a tiny hole. Can anybody tell me what that hole is? Please. What is that hole?
Spinal fluid comes out.
That's where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be going through. That's right. And that is the central canal. Okay, it's going to be along the entire length of your spinal cord. Okay, so you are going to have, remember last class, just go back to last class here. We were talking about this flow of information. You touch something hot, the sensory receptor sends a signal through the sensory neuron, which will take that sensory information to your CNS, and then the motor neuron will be carrying the command back to your effector, right? Okay, this path. So we are going to try to do that here. You will see that, your hand touched something hot, and then your sensory neuron is going to actually go in through the back of the spinal cord. Okay, and then inside the gray matter of the spinal cord, it is going to make a connection with the interneuron. Okay, and then that's going to decide what to do with that information, and then it's going to get sent out at the front. Okay, so this is the motor neuron coming out at the front, and then you're going to have your sensory neuron going in at the back, and then you're going to have the interneuron in the gray matter. Now these two neurons are actually going to be bundled together, okay, and it forms one of your spinal nerve. Okay. Now, at the same time that this is happening, the sensory neuron is also going to make a connection with another neuron that's going to be taking the information up to your brain. Okay, so you actually have many of these neurons going up to the brain from different parts of the body, and then collectively they form what's called the ascending tract. Okay, so these are white matter actually, containing the sensory information from all over the body. Somewhere along the way, they will cross the midline. Okay, usually at the brainstem, okay, at the medulla oblongata, they will cross the midline, and then they will go up to the thalamus. Okay, they will go up to the thalamus, where the information will be filtered, and then it will get projected to different parts of the cerebral cortex, depending on what information it's containing. Okay, if it's containing like pain from the hand, then it's going to go to the parietal lobe. If it's related to vision, then it's going to go to the occipital lobe. Okay, so the thalamus will filter that information and redirect it to the appropriate part of the brain. And then when your brain decides what to do with it, it's going to come back down. Okay, it's going to go through the midline, and then on its way down, it's going to be traveling down from the front of the spinal cord. Okay, from the front of the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the descending tract. descending track. Okay, so sensory information that needs to go up to the brain goes up at the back through the ascending track, and motor information that's coming down from the brain is going to be coming down at the front of the spinal cord through the descending track. Okay, the psi is kind of mixed. Okay, there's some going up, some going down, so don't worry about that. Just worry about the front and the back. Okay, so this is the anterior. This is the posterior. Okay, so that's the kind of like the flow of information. Part of it is what we talked about last class, and a part of it's kind of new. The part that actually goes up to the brain. Is that okay? Any question? Okay. Give 2 examples of spinal reflexes. So spinal reflexes are reflexes that only involves the spinal cord. Okay. Only involve the spinal cord. Okay. So 2 examples of spinal reflexes are knee jerk reflex. Okay, so like if you tap on someone's patella tendon at the knee, then the leg will kick forward a little bit, right? So that's the knee jerk reflex. And then the other one that we talked about in the lecture is the Babinski reflex, where if you stroke the bottom of the feet of a baby, then their toes are going to fan out in a particular pattern. These are spinal reflexes. It only involves the spinal cord. Okay, and a reflex, in case you need a definition, a reflex is, what is a reflex? Okay. It is an automatic response to a stimulus. Okay, you don't have to learn this reflex. It's just like hardwired into your system. Okay, you know how to do it as soon as you were born. Okay, like you put a. Have you ever heard that or seen videos of like babies swimming? Like we're talking about like really young babies, right? Like they throw them in the swimming pool and then they seemingly just know how to swim and not drown. That's a reflex. Okay, you put them in into the water, and then the reflex causes them not to breathe under the water. But some reflexes we lose as we grow up, and you know, that's one example of reflex that will be gone when we grow up, and then we kind of have to learn how to swim on our own afterwards. Okay, cranial reflex. These are conveyed through cranial nerves. Okay, involves the brain. So no spinal cord this time, just the brain. Any examples of cranial reflexes? Anybody? Okay, so like pupil dilation. Okay, when your pupil dilate in dark settings, or if they constrict in bright setting, that's actually a reflex, and it's carried by the cranial nerves, right? One of the 12 pairs that you have. Swallowing, sneezing. I know this is more than 2, but I'm just going to give you a bunch. Coughing, vomiting. Okay, all these are cranial reflexes. Okay. Give 2 examples of skill memories. Okay, skill memories are stored in the cerebellum. Okay, let me write it nicely. Cerebellum. okay, which is the structure that is at the back of the brain. Okay, and they are very persistent. Once you've learned a skill memory, it's not really gonna go away. Okay, so example of skill memory would be like typing. Okay, if you know how to type, you're not gonna forget how to type. Okay, if you type on your phone, you can actually close your eyes and type, and you wouldn't even miss the letters. Okay, because the skill memory has created kind of like a template, right, of the keyboard in your cerebellum, and then you're not gonna forget how to do it. Okay, even if you don't type for like a year or 2 years, if I give you a keyboard, you probably will still be able to type. What's another example of skill memories besides typing? Anybody? Even if you're learning about this for the first time, you should be able to come up with an example based on what I just told you. Yep, riding a bike, that's a good one. Riding a bike. Okay. Decorative memory, these are things that are stored in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is where you store long-term memory in the brain. Example of decorative memory is like factual stuff. Okay, so like the things you're learning in this class, they are all stored in the hippocampus. And the thing about storing things in the hippocampus is that if you don't use it, if you don't recall that fact for some time, it will be gone. Okay, it's not there anymore. Okay? So for example, if I ask you, right, what cell is needed to activate a naive B cell? And if you haven't been studying the material since that first test, maybe you don't remember anymore, right? And if it's lost, then it's lost. Okay? You have to reinforce it to know it. But for some stuff, if you recite it enough times, then you are going to remember it. Okay, then you're going to remember it. It's going to get converted into permanent long-term memory. So like, the times tables, right? If you have been reciting it since you're a kid, you probably will remember it. Okay. Like sometimes you might even remember your first phone number because you keep on giving it out to people. Remember back in the days, we don't store the phone numbers on our phone, right? You kind of have to write down, right? So, people might remember the phone numbers. Another example is formulas or something. Okay, in your chemistry formula, right? You might remember if I say carbon dioxide, you will know it's CO2, right? That's an example of decorative memory. Okay. State the function of the limbic system and list 4 main parts of the limbic system and briefly state the function of each. Okay, so the limbic system in brief is basically the reward system of the brain. Okay, so what the limbic system does is it collectively causes pleasant, so things that makes you feel good, and unpleasant feelings about your experiences. Okay, so every day we do a bunch of things. Some things makes you feel pleasant, some things makes you feel unpleasant, some experience makes you feel happy, some experience makes you feel scared. So the limbic system is going to screen all these encounters, all these experiences you have, and then what's going to happen is they will use these memory. Okay, the limbic system uses these memories, okay, the encounters that you have, the pleasantness of it and the unpleasantness of it, Going to use all these memories to guide a person's behavior. That will increase the chances of survival. Okay, so the limbic system is not really what it used to be anymore. Like if you think about our ancestors, right, living in the wild, living in caves or something, there are so many dangers out there. So the limbic system is going to be very active to help increase the chance of survival. For example, right, if they I don't really know what the ancestors do, but you know, if they eat some berries, okay, and then it tastes so sweet, okay, so the limbic system will light up, and then it will remember, oh, those berries taste sweet, and it makes you feel full after you eat it. So after a while, your limbic system would create this craving, right? So that you would want to go find those berries again, and that urge to go forage, that will increase the chances of survival, because you know you would want to go get the food, and you know make sure that you have energy, right, to go on. Another example is if you have encountered like I don't know, like a bear or something, and then that bear caused you to be injured, right? Then that's an unpleasant experience. So next time you see a bear from far away, then you know to avoid it, okay? Because you know if you engage it, you might get injured, and that would decrease your chance of survival. Okay, so that's basically what the limbic system is, you know, in its ancestral form. But nowadays, right, like if you're hungry, you're just gonna go grab food from the fridge or go buy food, right? There's no urgency to get it. So the limbic system has kind of evolved into kind of like a just having craving for stuff. Like sometimes you crave for chocolates, right? It's not really related to survival, but last time you ate that chocolate, it makes you feel really good, and then you just want to have another one, right? Craving for ice cream and whatnot, right? So it's not necessarily related to survival, which is why we call it like the reward system now. Okay, but in its root, the limbic system, right, for a lot of animals, for sure, uses these experiences to you know increase your chances of survival. Okay, a more modern example of that bear running towards you, it's like you know, if a person makes you feel uncomfortable, if a person makes you feel threatened, okay, then next time you see that person, you would want to avoid them. Okay, and sometimes in some cases, if that person has make you feel very unsafe in the past, then even seeing a picture of that person would, you know, cause your adrenaline to pump up, right? That's the limbic system, you know, acting up. One last thing, it could also be, you know, related to addiction, right? Okay, so people who are addicted to drugs, people are addicted to like gambling, to whatever they're addicted to, shopping sometimes, right? That's the reward system, right? Going a little bit out of balance, because those experience creates a pleasant emotion, and you know you cannot stop doing them in some cases. So what are the main parts of the limbic system? Well, we have the hippocampus. Okay, we have the hypothalamus. We have the amygdala. And we have the thalamus. Okay, so to remember this, you can think of like a hippopotamus. Hippopotamus. That's my best hippo drawing. You can think of a hippopotamus wearing a hat. Okay, so hippocampus, hat, H-A-T. Okay, so hippocampus, what does it do? Well, I told you already, it stores memory. So all those pleasant and unpleasant experience that you had to remember them. That's going to be stored in the hippocampus. The hypothalamus is responsible for autonomic responses and hormone secretion. right? When that bear is charging towards you, you're gonna have to release the adrenaline, and some of the hormone secretion is regulated by the hippocampus. And the amygdala. Amygdala is responsible for emotion. All the emotion you feel, happy, sad, angry, frustrated, all those things. That's part of the amygdala. Finally, thalamus. Thalamus is, I sort of mentioned it earlier, right? It helps you filter some of the sensory information, okay? So filters and help process sensory input. Okay, so you cannot process all your experiences. Some things are just not worth filtering. Like, for example, like if I ask you, right, what did you eat for lunch last Wednesday? Anybody remember what they eat for lunch last Wednesday? Probably not, right? I don't even remember what I eat for lunch like 2 days ago, right? And that's probably because that's information that gets filtered by the thalamus. Right? We don't have spots for those things, unless it's like something that's special. Right? If last Wednesday was your birthday and then you had a big dinner, you're probably going to remember what you eat, right? Because the emotion associated with that experience was pleasant, and that's more likely to be stored in your hippocampus. Okay, so things that are particularly pleasant or unpleasant, those are going to be stored easily in the memory. Things that are mundane, no special meaning to you, it's not going to stay on its own. Right? It takes effort to remember them. That's why it's so hard to memorize everything I'm teaching you, right? Like it's for most people anyways, right? I cannot speak for everyone, but for most people, like taking a course like this, there's no like emotional attachment to it. Okay, it's just something that you have to get through, kind of, right, to go to your next program or whatnot. So it's not really pleasant. Okay, it could be a little bit unpleasant, but not so unpleasant that you are afraid, right? It's not like you open the anatomy textbook and then your heart is racing, right? So it's not that kind of unpleasantness. So for that reason, there's no extreme emotion attached to all these things, and which is why it's so hard to remember all the facts. Okay, so that is that. Are we okay? Any question? Are we still there? Okay, I know you guys have a test afterwards, so I'm gonna skip the break and just finish this thing up so you can go study a little bit more. Shouldn't be long, maybe just half an hour or so. Okay, next we have to identify the lobe that matches the description. Right? There are 5 lobes that you have to know, and you have to know, which lobe corresponds to which area. Okay. Okay. Thanks for letting me know, Rochelle. Okay. First one contains Wernicke's area. Okay. Which lobe contains Wernicke's area? Wernicke's area is the part of the brain that allows you to understand spoken and written communication. Okay. If I'm speaking to you right now, which I am, I'm speaking to you right now, and you're understanding the words that I'm saying, that's the Wernicke's area doing its job. If you read a question on the paper, right, identify the lobe that matches the description. If you're able to read that and understand what that's saying, that's the Wernicke's area. Okay, so where do you find the Wernicke's area? Wernicke's area, it's found in the only left side for most people, parietal lobe. Okay, we just say parietal lobe. Okay. Sorry. Temporal lobe. I mean temporal lobe. Okay. So let me just quickly go to this brain and tell you which lobe is which. Okay. So this is a typical brain. We have the frontal lobe here. Frontal. Okay. We have the parietal lobe here. we have the, what is this thing? This is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe. And at the back, we have the occipital lobe. Okay, and then the fifth one is behind the frontal and the temporal lobe. It's called the insula. Okay, which we'll learn more next class. Okay, so Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe. It is actually right here. Okay, that's the Wernicke's area. Okay, we can actually label that. Okay. Sorry. Okay. It's the interpretive area of the brain. It allows you to understand what people are saying. It allows you to understand what you're reading. The next one is the Broca's area. The Broca's area is around here in the frontal lobe. Okay, around here in the frontal lobe. For most people, is on the left side of the brain. Okay, that is the Broca's area. Broca area. It allows you to speak in a fluent manner, to use the correct syntax. Okay, people who damage the Broca's area, they would not be using the right words in the right context. Okay, so instead of say, can you pass me the pen? Okay, so they might use some other words instead of pens, like can you pass me the raincoat or something like that. And the sentence structure and grammar would all be wrong, not because they don't speak the language, but because the area is damaged, and they would have no way of, they would have trouble organizing the words in the proper with the proper sentence structure. Okay, so the Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe. Okay, a couple of other areas here. The primary motor cortex, it's also in the frontal lobe. The primary motor cortex allows you to do voluntary movement. Voluntary movement. Okay, every time you move any part of your body voluntarily, it comes from the primary motor cortex. I'll show you where it is on the diagram afterwards. Primary somatosensory cortex, it's going to be in the parietal lobe. Okay, so all the sensory information related to your skin is going to end up in your primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so if you touch a rough surface, that rough feeling, that texture, it's going to go to the primary somatosensory cortex. Temperature, pain, right? Pressure, all that's going to go here, and it's in the parietal lobe. Auditory association area, it's in the temporal lobe. Okay, and association area is an area that aggregate information related to a particular sense. So in this case, related to sound, that's what auditory is. So, if you hear a particular song and you recognize that song, right, that's going to be in the temporal lobe. Okay, if you hear a ringtone and you know who's calling, right, because you set that special ringtone for that special person, that auditory association area is the area that's going to be processing that information. Okay, processing visual information, all visual information is going to go to the occipital lobe. For smell, it's going to go to the temporal lobe as well. Okay, so let's key in some of these area here. The primary motor cortex is right here. Okay, located at the back of your frontal lobe. I need a stronger color right here. Okay, that's for voluntary movement. Okay. If you need to move your hands, if you need to, write something down, right? Move your eyeballs, all that stuff comes from this area. Primary motor cortex. And right behind it, right, in the parietal lobe, this is the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, there's a fissure here. There's a groove that separates the two. This is called the central sulcus. Okay. Another thing you should know about the primary motor cortex and primary somatosensory cortex is that they are divided into different zones. Okay, so like this here is for hand. Okay, this here is for face. Right? And then, your legs are going to be like on the inside, so on and so forth. So you can see the PowerPoint slides for exactly how they're divided. So we're looking at the left side of the brain. So if you want to move the right hand, it's going to be this area. Okay. So if you have a stroke at this point, then you would have trouble controlling your right hand. If you have a stroke here, what's going to be the problem? You're going to have trouble doing what? If this part of the brain is damaged, what problem are we going to be experiencing? If you damage this part of the brain, then you will have trouble feeling the right side of your face. Okay, remember, the primary somatosensory cortex is for sensation, right? Feelings. And this is for voluntary control. So if you damage this part, you cannot feel the right side of the face. You can still move it, you can't feel it. Okay. If you damage this part, you won't be able to move the right side of your face. It will appear to be droopy, but you can still feel it. Okay. Occipital lobe is for vision. All right, we talked about that earlier. Temporal lobe is for smell and hearing. Okay. And the frontal lobe, in addition to these two areas, is responsible for higher order thinking, abstract thinking, right? Personality, all the complicated stuff that we do, that happens in the frontal lobe. Okay. And that is that. Okay. We will do the application question next time. Hopefully, more of you will have watched the recordings by then. It just doesn't make sense for me to go through the application questions right now because you guys got to get the basic done first, right? Like to know at least which part of the brain does what before we can even talk about this. Okay, so more on that later. And if you want me to talk about the long answer questions next class, we can do that as well. Okay, but now we're going to fill in the fill in the blanks. And if you haven't done that already, I mean, I assume none of you have done, most of you haven't done it already. So you will do it again later on, and then you will check the answers. Okay, but let's go through them quickly. Site of regulation of water balance and body temperature. That is the job of the hypothalamus. Okay, hypothalamus is the master gland, the master gland. Okay, it controls a lot of the autonomic functions in the body. We first heard about the hypothalamus in lecture 3, right? When we talk about fever, right? The prostaglandin is going to act on the hypothalamus to crank up the body temperature if you need to have a fever. 4 pairs of cranial nerves originates from the pons. Okay, so there are a total of 12. 4 of them comes out from the pons. Pons means the bridge. It connects various parts of the brain together. Connects the 3rd and 4th ventricle. That is, we talked about this earlier, that is the cerebral aqueduct. Middle layer of the meninges. Okay, we have 3 layers, the dura mater on the outside, the arachnoid mater in the middle, and then the pia mater at the innermost layer. collects excess CSF. That is the dural venous sinus. Contains Wernicke's area. We just talked about that. That is going to be in the temporal lobe. Maintains muscle tone, balance, and posture. That is the cerebellum. Oh, I actually missed a question earlier. We'll go back to it. A structure that forms CSF. So I mentioned about this multiple times already. That is the choroid plexus. Layer of the meninges that is in direct contact with the CNS. That would be the pia mater. Primary motor speech area, the parts of the brain that allows you to talk properly, right, with proper syntax and everything. That's the Broca's area. Forms the side and the roof of the third ventricle. Okay, that is the thalamus. The bumps on the surface of the cerebrum, it is the gyrus. Okay, gyri for plural. An area found on the precentral gyrus, that would be the primary motor cortex. Region on the parietal lobes where all somatosensory inputs are projected. That is the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so like all somatosensory inputs refers to everything you can feel with your skin. Okay, the pressure, the texture, the pain, the temperature. White matter allowing communication between the two hemispheres. Okay, I mentioned this a couple of times already today as well. That is the corpus callosum. Part of the limbic system, the reward system responsible for memory. That would be the hippocampus. Contains visual association area in the occipital lobe. Glial cells that form the BBB, astrocytes. They are star-looking cells. A groove in the brain, that is sulcus. Sulci for plural. The groove that separates the two hemispheres, that is the longitudinal fissure. Outer layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex and its gray matter. If the meninge has inflammation, we call that meningitis. Accumulation of CSF in the brain is hydrocephalus. Areas in the brain where integration occurs and where memories are stored is the association area. If you damage the Broca's area, the person might have something called Broca's aphasia. Okay, they will have trouble expressing themselves. General interpretive area for speech, to understand what people are saying to you, to understand what you're reading, we need the Wernicke's area. Okay. Relay center of the brain, thalamus. Regulate hormones secreted by the pituitary gland, that is the hypothalamus, the master gland. A web of gray matter running through brainstem responsible for maintaining mental alertness. That is the reticular formation. Continuous reflex centers concerned with head movement in response to visual and auditory stimuli. That is the pons and midbrain. %90 of tracts crosses the midline at the medulla oblongata. Store motor skills. These are like repetition, like typing, playing piano, riding a bike. That is stored in the cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum. Okay, part of the limbic system that governs emotion, amygdala. Amygdala. The reflex that involves curling of toes upward, fanning out the toes when the sole of the foot is struck. That is the Babinski reflex, okay, which will disappear after age of 2. Receives all sensory input except smell, thalamus. Okay, so that is all there is for today. Good luck with your chemistry test. And you know, if you after you watch the recording and you have questions, feel free to email me. I'll see you all next week. And for next week, we'll be doing the eye and the ears. Okay, so please watch the recordings before coming to class.
Excuse me.
Yep, go ahead, please.
Could you zoom out a little bit so I can take a picture?
Oh, of course.
Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Bye now.